Ryan also has some great reporting in The Intercept this week on Afghanistan and on the funds from the Afghan central bank. So let's move on to that. Here's the headline from Ryan at The Intercept: U.S. to release stolen Afghan central bank funds to Swiss bank. It's always a Swiss bank.
Gotta be a Swiss bank.
Ryan, tell us about this story.
Hide it in the Swiss bank.
Tell us how you went about getting comment from the Taliban.
Oh, yes. So, right, in this story, I've been reaching out to the Taliban for comment when I write about Afghanistan for a couple years now. I think, predating when they took over, because it's just what you're supposed to do. Actually, it was Anand Gopal, who I had on Deconstructed, my podcast once, who wrote the book No Good Men Among the Living, which is maybe the best book I've ever read, but definitely the best book about Afghanistan. Just an incredible piece of work. I think it's one of the greatest kind of writers / reporters that's working today. And I asked him, I was like, how do you got a good contact over there? And he's like, yeah, try a couple of these people. And they eventually got me to a guy who is the Taliban spokesperson.
What a job.
But his official title is head of the political office.
It's I assume as you interact with them now, they are a government. They're.
And I asked another Taliban source. I was like, his name's Suhail Shaheen. I was like, is Suhail still spokesperson? They're like, yep. And so I ping Suhail. Maybe we can put that. We can read their comment up, and then we can get into the context of the story. I think that is that's tear sheet E4. Start with that one. But basically, what the Taliban is saying here is that. Actually, I don't have my glasses on. Can you read that?
Yeah, the Afghanistan bank funds belong to the DAB, should be returned to Afghanistan, said Suhail Shaheen, a spokesperson for the Taliban who serves as head of the political office. In this critical time when 99% of Afghans are living under the poverty line, it is direly needed that the reserves will return to the country.
Right, so basically what happened is that during the occupation, the United States set up the DAB, Afghanistan Bank, which is the central bank modeled on the U.S. Federal Reserve, staffed it with Americans. There's still at least one American, Shah Mehrabi, who we had on Rising. He lives in Maryland.
Right.
And he's one of 5 central bankers on the Afghanistan Central Bank. So it built up foreign currency reserves through its monetary policy. To the tune of about $9 billion. $7 billion of those reserves were being held by the New York Federal Reserve during the occupation. About $2 billion were being held by the European Union's, whatever their New York Federal Reserve version is over there. When Kabul fell to the Taliban, the U.S. froze the money. So and also instructed the EU freeze their $2 billion as well. Also instructed the IMF and World Bank to halt all projects that were ongoing in Afghanistan and all lending. And so what predictably happened was the currency completely collapsed. And you think we have bad inflation here. The inflation over there went completely insane. Government employees, which makes up a huge portion, teachers and others, were no longer getting paychecks. If you went to the bank, sometimes you'd have to wait days, and you could only get up to a couple $100 at a time. Imports basically ceased because you need the central bank to balance the import-export payments. They don't even have the ability to print their own currency. They had a contract with, it was either a Polish or Romanian currency printing company, and the U.S. stepped in and halted that too. So even though they had already put in the order for their cash, and so, which is called the Afghani, and they get really upset if you call Afghan people Afghanis. They're like, that's our currency.
Right.
We're Afghans, not Afghanis. So that's just a little thing for the next Afghan person you meet. Don't call them an Afghani. It's being called a dollar. And so the result is this dystopian situation that's almost unique in American history in the sense that everywhere you look, the shops have food. There is enough food in the country. There's a drought, there is a crisis, there would be economic difficulties, obviously, going on without this, but there is enough food for everybody. Yet, you have people starving to death, you have people selling their kidneys, you have more than 1 million people have fled to Iran, not for reasons of political persecution, they're getting treated absolutely horribly in Iran. but they're starving to death, and so they're fleeing the country because nobody has access to the money needed to buy the food that is everywhere. It's just such an insane situation. And so, and because here in the United States, everybody just says, well, what are you going to do? Give the Taliban money so they can just spend it on terrorism? It's like, no, we set up a central bank that operates independently, whose job it is to engage in currency auctions, keep the currency stable, and to combat inflation. If we don't like the way that they're doing that, we could instantly freeze the money again. Like it's not like we're going to dump $7 billion in cash just on the runway and then walk away. And so what I reported this week is that they've finally come up with this solution that they're going to take $3.5 billion of it, and they're still going to hold that for the small number of 9/11 plaintiff families, which they will probably lose that case, by the way. But for now, they're going to send $3.5 billion to this Swiss bank, Bank of International Settlements, and they're instructing the EU to release their $2 billion. So they'll have $5.5 billion, which they'll be able to use and they're setting up a trusteeship, which they'll be able to use for monetary policy, which is good, which is the appropriate use of that money. But also, they're instructing it to be used for humanitarian purposes, like paying for electricity and paying for other imports, which sounds good, but is not good. Because it would be as if the Federal Reserve stepped in and just started buying oil for everybody. Like, then what happens? Then what happens when the Federal Reserve is back out of money? Like, well, the Fed is the head of an empire, they can print more money. But imagine you're not the Federal Reserve, you're the Afghanistan Central Bank. When if they draw their reserves all the way down, then they're right back in the situation they're in today, unable to stabilize their currency, balance their payments. And so they did set up a process that will allow them to return the money to the Afghan Central Bank. Maybe they're kicking it past the midterms. They set up 3 different criteria, which seem easy to meet. But so that's where we are. That's where we are now.
It's one of the things you said. Really, I was thinking about it last night. Actually, so it's almost unprecedented in American history, and it's kind of an odd statement on what modern war looks like, because in the past, like for most of human history, the idea of negotiating this way and the idea of these funds being frozen and being, it's very strange the way this war transpired, and the way that the United States was not really fighting for land, and the entire mission of the war was strange. And so then it's like, well, what do you do with the funds? Do you give them to the Taliban, which you initially were fighting, but decided?
I get it. It's embarrassing.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And the Biden administration doesn't want to be seen saying Republicans going out and saying the Biden administration, absolutely just funded the Taliban, et cetera, et cetera. But the nuance that you point out, and it looks like they're getting closer to. I wonder what your perspective is on why that was lost for a year, right? Why basically it was just this black and white conversation, because you've been covering this a lot over the course of the last year, and I've been following your reporting. There was always a middle ground, but even though there was always a middle ground, that seems perfectly reasonable to me, and like something that would hardly be enormously controversial, because it's not a huge headline banner news story anyway. Why was that lost?
I think maybe some inertia, some spite, and some politics. Like maybe that's the soup that they were dining out on there, and nobody cared. Like it's just a deep level of cruelty. I think
that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, and it's a callousness. I think it's a crime against humanity that rivals some of the greatest of the 20th century. Like just with a press of a button at the New York Federal Reserve to drive millions of people into starvation, like the most painful way to die. Like and what people like the kidney example is just the kind of the most vivid, but people are selling their children. People are selling their furniture in order to get food. People are then burning the remainder of their furniture to stay warm. All of which are just solutions that. And these are people who have money, like in the bank.
Right.
They just can't get it because the U.S. pressed a button and shut the economy down. And people might jump into the comments and be like, well, during the potato famine, Ireland was growing enough food to feed everyone in Ireland. Yes, that's true, and that's why we call it a British genocide. They were exporting that food, though.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if the food was just sitting in front of people.
Right.
and they were unable to get it. It was like, guards were like marshaling it out of the country. The food is there.
So answer the devil's advocate question that is probably on a lot of people's minds. What are the risks then of releasing funds to the Taliban? And to your point, just pushing a button, I mean, it sounds like the most reasonable solution is more than just pushing a button. It's pushing a button and finding the right route for it to take to be in better hands. What are the risks?
So the risks would be that the Taliban, so let's say, Shah Rabi, the banker, the central banker that we've interviewed has said, let's just start with, I forget what we're saying, 150 million a month or a week. And then we'll use that for currency auctions, which then stabilizes the currency and projects confidence into the economy, gets cash into the banks, gets cash into the economy. Let's say you do that. The worst case scenario there, Taliban shows up with AK-47s and says, actually, this $150 million is ours. We're seizing it. We're using it for whatever nefarious purposes the worst thing that you can imagine the Taliban might use $150 million for. If they did that, the next shipment just gets paused. So,
but you still had already handed over.
Yeah, $150 million, which, I mean, I think people would think that that's a lot of money. The Taliban would not do that, though. And the reason they wouldn't do that is because they don't want to oversee an economy where 99% of the people are living under the poverty line, where millions of people, only 30 million people in the country, where millions are fleeing, and where, most importantly, the Al-Qaeda branch over there, the ISIS branch over there, gain in power as people become more desperate. And
and as the United States is more easily blamed for their desperation.
Right. And then you come in and say, wow, the Taliban were moderate compared to the people that have come in and replaced the Taliban because of this. And the other, what I would
seems
ask,
like we would have figured that one out.
Right. And what I would ask people is what's your goal here, other than just spite, other than saying I don't want to give the Taliban central bank any money. Why? What's the goal there? Do you think that if you drive 100% of the population under the poverty line, that then the people will overthrow the Taliban and replace them with a liberal democratic government that is supportive of the United States and supportive of the West? Why would that happen under those circumstances when we couldn't make it stick with 20 years of occupation? If you do foment some type of revolt in Afghanistan, it's just going to be ISIS that steps in and takes whatever modicum of power is left.
The vacuum.
Right. So I don't quite understand. So yeah, I think the absolute worst case scenario, you send $150 million in there, and before it gets to the banks and before it's able to pay for imports, it's just seized by the Taliban. But why on earth would they do that and then cost themselves because they could actually make much more money by getting the economy going again and actually having economic activity that you can then tax. Now, the real risk, though, is the Taliban harboring people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That's why we went to war with them in the first place. They were harboring Al-Qaeda. They're now at war with Al-Qaeda.
Again.
And they don't have ambitions of attacking the United States yet.
Again, you'd think that after 20 years of war in both Afghanistan and Iraq, where we saw similar things play out, where we saw the radicalization happening in the shadow of some similar problems, that we would be, although it sounds like as they're walking towards the solution that you're reporting on, it sounds like there may be some awareness of that.
Yeah. And for people who want to read more about it, you can throw up, I think there's a second tear sheet. It's this written by a guy who oversaw the Ecuadorian central bank, and he wrote about how global politics kept getting Ecuadorian central bank money seized all over the country, and the way it drove their economy completely wild. And you're right, we're in these modern times, we fight wars in different ways, and it's with these bankers and these keystrokes.
Right. Yeah, which is extremely strange.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.